A freezing night, a shivering man on the corner of Elm and Fourth, clutching a tattered coat, minding his own business. Two patrol cars pulled up, lights blinding, sirens chirping. To the officer stepping out, he was just another target, a nobody they could push around to pass the time on a slow shift. They shoved him, mocked him, and thought they had all the power. They were dead wrong. The man they were breaking was their new boss. The city was breathing its usual midnight breath, a freezing damp exhale that smelled of exhaust, stale beer, and desperation. The streets were mostly barren save for the occasional delivery truck rumbling over pothole-scarred asphalt and stray dogs picking through alley dumpsters. Sitting on a frost-covered bus bench, wrapped in a soiled, oversized olive-drab military surplus jacket, was a man the world chose to ignore. His face was obscured by a thick, unkempt graying beard and a heavy wool beanie pulled down low over his eyes. His hands, encased in fingerless gloves, were wrapped tightly around a styrofoam cup that had long since surrendered its warmth. To anyone driving by, he was just another piece of urban blight, a sad statistic of the city's crumbling social safety net. But beneath the layers of grime, the artificially scuffed boots, and the carefully applied scent of cheap whiskey and unwashed clothes, the man's mind was sharper than a scalpel. His name was Elias Thorne. Weeks earlier, he had been sworn in as the new chief of police. Elias had not come to comfortably ride out his remaining years before a plush retirement. He had been specifically recruited by the mayor to perform an exorcism. For years, the department, specifically the 4th Precinct, had been hemorrhaging taxpayer money in brutality settlements, false arrest lawsuits, and civil rights violations. The local papers called the 4th Precinct the Wild West. The internal reports Elias had reviewed during his first week were sanitized masterpieces of creative writing. Every use of force was justified. Every broken jaw was the result of a suspect resisting. And every suspiciously missing body cam footage was attributed to technical malfunctions. Elias knew that you couldn't diagnose a cancer by just looking at the paperwork. You had to look at the cells. He had spent decades in a major city working his way up from beat cop to deputy superintendent. He knew the look, the walk, and the talk of a bad cop. He also knew that as a black man in a high-ranking position, he was often presented with the absolute best behavior his subordinates could muster when he walked the halls in his dress uniform with the gold stars gleaming on his collar. They smiled, they saluted, and they hid their true faces. So Elias decided to give them a different face. He had spent hours perfecting the disguise. The beard was meticulously applied theatrical hair. The dirt under his fingernails was potting soil mixed with grease. He had even practiced the hunched, defeated posture of a man who had been beaten down by the world. Taped securely to his chest beneath 3 layers of thermal shirts was a state-of-the-art high-definition digital audio recorder. In his left boot, a small GPS tracker pinged his location directly to the encrypted phone of Captain Marcus Harlan, the only other person in the entire city who knew about this operation. "Stay safe out there," Captain Harlan had warned him earlier that evening. "The mid-shift boys in the 4th, they play by the rules. They're a pack." "That's exactly why I'm going fishing," Elias had replied, adjusting his tattered jacket. "I need to know exactly what kind of predators are swimming in my waters." Now shivering on the bus bench, the freezing wind biting through the denim of his worn-out jeans, Elias waited. He wasn't doing anything illegal. He was simply existing in a public space. According to the law, he had every right to sit on that bench. But according to the unwritten laws of the 4th Precinct, he was an eyesore. The unmistakable low growl of a police cruiser's engine broke the silence of the street. Elias didn't look up, but his peripheral vision caught the reflection of the black and white Ford Explorer slowly rolling down the street. The cruiser crept past him, its tires crunching softly on the frost-dusted pavement. The brake lights flared bright red, bleeding into the dark street. The vehicle stopped a short distance away. It sat there for a long, tense moment, idling like a metal beast, sizing up its prey. Then the cruiser violently threw itself into reverse, the engine whining in protest, and backed up at a dangerous speed before slamming on the brakes right in front of the bus bench. The heavy beams of the spotlight mounted on the driver's side pillar snapped on, blindingly white, hitting Elias squarely in the face. Elias squeezed his eyes shut and raised a trembling gloved hand to shield his face, playing his part perfectly. "Hey man," he mumbled, his voice raspy and intentionally weak. "Come on, the light." The driver's side door popped open, followed a second later by the passenger side. "Well, well, well," a voice sneered from the darkness behind the blinding light. It was a young voice, arrogant and dripping with venom. "What do we have here, Fowler? Looks like a piece of trash blew out of the dumpster and landed on our nice clean bench." "Sure looks like it, Hayes," another voice chuckled, the heavy thud of combat boots hitting the pavement. Officers Harlan Crow and Riley Grant. Elias knew their files by heart. Crow was young, with several excessive force complaints in recent months, all mysteriously dismissed by the union reps. Grant was a known enabler, completely lacking a moral compass, happy to ride shotgun to Crow's abuses. The real test had begun. Elias took a slow, measured breath, letting the icy air fill his lungs. He lowered his hand slightly, squinting into the glare, waiting for the badge-carrying thugs to make their next move. "I asked you a question, old man," Officer Crow barked, his silhouette cutting through the blinding halo of the spotlight. He approached with the swagger of a high school bully, his hand resting casually on the butt of his taser. I didn't hear a question, officer," Elias stammered, modulating his deep baritone into a meek, wavering rasp. He kept his eyes averted, staring at the scuffed tips of his boots. "I'm just resting, just waiting." "Waiting for what?" Officer Grant chimed in, rounding the front of the cruiser. He was taller than Crow, broader in the shoulders, chewing on a piece of gum with a bovine rhythm. "The buses don't run till morning, buddy. You're loitering." "It's a public bench, sir," Elias said quietly. "Just needed to get off my feet. It's cold." "Oh, he knows his rights, Riley," Crow sneered, stepping within arm's reach of Elias. The smell of cheap cologne and stale coffee radiated off the young officer. "We got a constitutional scholar out here freezing his ass off." Crow suddenly kicked the toe of Elias's boot hard enough to sting. "Stand up." Elias calculated the legalities in a split second. A Terry stop requires reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime is occurring, has occurred, or is about to occur. Sitting on a bench is not a crime. This was an unlawful order. But as an undercover operative testing his men, he needed to see the full scope of their corruption. He slowly pushed himself off the bench, letting out a convincing groan as he stood, keeping his posture slouched. He was physically larger than both men, a solid 6'2" beneath the baggy layers, but he compressed himself, making himself look smaller, weaker, and entirely vulnerable. "Hands out of your pockets," Grant commanded, unsnapping the retention strap on his holster, an aggressive, unnecessary escalation. Elias complied, pulling his hands out and holding them loosely at his sides. "I ain't doing nothing wrong, officers. My name's James. I'm just trying to stay out of the wind." "I don't give a damn if your name is the King of England," Crow snapped. He stepped into Elias's personal space, aggressively crowding him. "You're in my sector, James, and in my sector, we don't like vagrants stinking up the bus stops. You make the good tax-paying folks uncomfortable." "Nobody else is out here," Elias pointed out mildly. "Don't get smart with me, boy," Crow hissed, his voice dropping to a menacing octave. The racial undertone of the word boy hit Elias like a physical blow. It was a word designed to strip away dignity, wielded by a young punk in a uniform against a man he perceived to be a helpless, elderly black man. Elias's jaw tightened beneath the false beard, but he kept his expression perfectly frightened. "Turn around, face the bench, put your hands on the back of it," Crow ordered. "Another violation, no probable cause for a search?" Elias turned around and placed his gloved hands on the freezing metal of the bench backrest. Before he could brace himself, Crow kicked Elias's legs apart violently, nearly dropping him to his knees. Grant laughed in the background. "Hey, take it easy, please," Elias cried out, playing the victim. Crow began a rough, invasive pat-down, his hands slapping aggressively against Elias's pockets, feeling down his legs, and roughly pulling up the hem of his heavy jacket. Elias held his breath, praying the thick layers of thermals and the baggy nature of his clothes would conceal the flat digital recorder taped to his sternum. "What's in the pockets?" Crow demanded, ignoring Elias's plea. He didn't wait for an answer. He plunged his hands into the deep pockets of the military jacket. He pulled out a crumpled pack of tissues, a few loose quarters, and a faded photograph of a young woman, a prop Elias had brought specifically to add humanity to his character. Crow looked at the items under the street lamp, then deliberately let them fall from his hands. The quarters clattered on the pavement, rolling into the gutter. The photograph fluttered down, landing face up in a puddle of muddy slush. "Hey, that's my daughter!" Elias yelled, letting a genuine flash of anger slip into his voice. He moved to turn around and grab the picture. "Stay facing the bench," Grant roared, shoving Elias hard between the shoulder blades. Elias hit the cold metal of the bench, his chest heaving. "You got ID, James?" Crow asked, seemingly unmoved by Elias's distress. "No, lost my wallet last week. I told you, I'm just resting." "No ID, no address, loitering, and resisting an officer," Crow listed off, ticking the imaginary charges on his fingers. "Sounds to me like you're having a very bad night, Jimmy." "I didn't resist," Elias said, forcing his voice to tremble. "Please, just let me get my picture and I'll walk away. I'll leave the sector." Crow looked at Grant and grinned. "He wants to leave the sector, Riley. I think we should help him out with that, don't you?" Grant chuckled, a dark, unpleasant sound. "Absolutely, Mitch. We're public servants. It's our job to provide transportation to those in need." Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew exactly what they were talking about. In some cities, they called it a rough ride. In others, it was a starlight tour. It was an old, ugly police tactic used to punish undesirables without the paperwork of an arrest. They would throw the victim into the back of a cruiser, drive them miles outside the city limits into the freezing countryside, and dump them on the side of a dark road to walk back. In sub-zero temperatures, it was torture. In some tragic cases, it was a death sentence. "Put your hands behind your back," Crow ordered, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. For what? What am I being arrested for? Elias asked, turning his head. You're not being arrested, Crow whispered, stepping close enough that Elias could smell the mint gum trying to mask the scent of tobacco on his breath. You're being relocated. Now give me your hands before I break your wrist. Elias allowed his hands to be pulled behind his back. The cold steel of the cuffs bit brutally into his wrists. Crow ratcheted them far too tight, ensuring the metal dug into the bone. Elias bit the inside of his cheek to suppress a grunt of pain. They grabbed him by the biceps, essentially lifting him off his feet, and frog-marched him toward the idling cruiser. As they approached the rear door, Elias noticed a small blinking red light on Crow's chest disappear. He had reached up and silently clicked off his body camera. Grant did the same a second later. They're going dark, Elias thought, his blood boiling. They're turning off the cameras so there's no record of the abduction. Watch your head, trash, Crow mocked before violently shoving Elias down into the back seat of the cruiser. Elias's head cracked against the plastic partition dividing the front and back seats. He slumped onto the hard plastic bench, the door slamming shut behind him, sealing him in the suffocating darkness of the cage. The back of a police cruiser is designed to be uncomfortable. It is a cage of hard plastic, metal mesh, and zero leverage. With his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, the awkward angle forced Elias to sit hunched forward, his shoulders screaming in protest. The heavy plexiglass partition separating him from Crow and Grant was smudged and scratched, but it couldn't block out the sound of their voices. The cruiser shifted into drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving Elias's meager belongings and the photograph in the puddle behind in the desolate night. Central, this is 4, Adam 12, Grant's voice crackled over the radio, sounding bored and entirely routine. Show us clear from Elman 4th, no report, resuming patrol. Copy 4, Adam 12, the dispatcher replied, unaware that her officers were currently committing a felony kidnapping. God, I hate this shift, Crow complained, the driver's seat turning the heat up. The warm air blasted into the front cabin, but the vents to the rear cage remained securely closed. Elias was left to shiver in the freezing back seat, the cold seeping through his inadequate layers. Just a few more hours, man, Grant replied, tapping on his phone. Then we hit up that diner on 9th for the breakfast special. Sarah's working. Yeah, well, we gotta take out the trash first, Crow said, glancing in the rearview mirror. His eyes met Elias's through the thick plexiglass. How you doing back there, Jimmy? Enjoying the ride? Elias didn't answer. He slumped against the plastic door panel, letting his chin rest on his chest. He was hyper-focused on the red recording light of the device taped to his chest. He needed them to keep talking. He needed them to dig their own graves so deep that not even the strongest police union attorney in the state could dig them out. He's giving us the silent treatment, Grant laughed. You think he's going to complain to the mayor? Who's he going to complain to? Crow scoffed. Look at him, he's a ghost, a nobody. These people, they come into our city, they suck up resources, they make the streets look like a damn third world country. And what does the brass want us to do? Hand out blankets and warm cocoa. Hear about the new chief? Grant asked, the conversation shifting exactly where Elias wanted it to go. Thorne? Crow spat the name like it was a curse word. Yeah, I heard about him. Some diversity hire they brought in from a major city to reform us. Guys like that, they don't know the streets. They sit in their plush offices, making substantial salaries, telling us how to do our jobs while we're out here in the mud, dealing with animals like Jimmy here. Elias's heart hammered a steady, furious rhythm against his ribs. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of these men was astounding. They felt entirely untouchable. I heard Thorne is looking to make an example out of the 4th precinct, Grant said, a hint of genuine concern creeping into his voice. Internal Affairs has been sniffing around Miller's squad. Let them sniff, Crow said dismissively, taking a hard right turn that threw Elias violently against the opposite door panel. The cuffs bit deeper into his wrist, drawing a thin line of blood. Sergeant Miller has our backs. The Union has our backs. Thorne is going to realize real quick that he can't run this city without us. If he pushes too hard, the blue flu hits. We all call out sick, let the city burn for a weekend. He'll come crawling back begging us to put the uniforms on. Elias memorized the name. Sergeant Marcus Harlan. He was their immediate supervisor. If Harlan was providing top cover for this kind of behavior, the rot went deeper than patrol officers. It meant middle management was actively conspiring to protect abusers. The city streetlights began to space out, becoming less frequent as the cruiser left the urban density and headed toward the desolate county lines. The buildings gave way to empty lots, industrial warehouses, and eventually the dark skeletal silhouettes of winter-stripped woods. Where are you taking me? Elias finally spoke up, letting his voice crack with feigned terror. Please, just let me out here. I can walk back. Walk back from here? Crow laughed, looking out the window at the pitch-black scenery. Nah, Jimmy, you need some exercise. Clear your head. We know a great spot, very scenic, lots of nature. It's freezing, Elias pleaded. I don't have a hat. My coat is thin. I'll freeze to death out here. Not our problem, Grant stated coldly. You should have thought about that before you decided to make our city look ugly. Consider this a motivational seminar to relocate to a different county. They were crossing the boundary line. The city limits ended at the crossing of the river bridge. The cruiser rumbled over the metal grating of the bridge, the tires singing a hollow, eerie tune. The temperature outside had dropped well below freezing. The wind chill was brutal. Dumping a man out here without proper winter gear, a significant distance from the nearest open business, was not just cruel, it was attempted murder. Crow pulled the cruiser onto a gravel turnout near the edge of a dense, unlit pine forest. The tires crunched to a halt. He shifted the car into park and turned off the headlights, plunging the vehicle into total darkness. Only the ambient glow of the police dashboard illuminated the cab. "End of the line, Jimmy," Crow said, unbuckling his seatbelt. Grant stepped out first, drawing his heavy maglite flashlight. He walked around to the rear passenger door and yanked it open. The biting wind instantly rushed into the cage, hitting Elias like a wall of ice. "Out!" Grant commanded, grabbing Elias by the collar of his jacket and hauling him out of the vehicle. Elias stumbled, his legs stiff from the cold and the awkward seating position. He landed hard on his knees in the frozen gravel. Grant didn't offer a hand, he just stepped back, shining the blinding beam of the flashlight directly into Elias's eyes. Crow walked around the back of the cruiser, his boots crunching loudly. He reached down, grabbed Elias by the arm, and hauled him to his feet. "Turn around," Crow barked. Elias turned, presenting his cuffed hands. He felt the cold metal of the key slide into the lock. The cuffs clicked open and Elias immediately brought his arms forward, rubbing his raw, bleeding wrist. "Now listen to me very carefully, Jimmy," Crow said, stepping close, jabbing a rigid finger into Elias's chest right over the hidden recorder. "If I ever see your ugly face in my city again, I won't be this nice. Next time I'll find some drugs in your pocket, and you'll spend the next several years in a concrete box. You understand me?" Elias looked down at the arrogant young officer. For a brief second, the facade of the terrified, broken, homeless man slipped. Elias Thorne's posture straightened, his shoulders squaring up. The aura of command and authority radiating from him was palpable, causing Crow to involuntarily take a half step back, confused by the sudden shift in the old man's demeanor. "I understand exactly what you are," Elias said, his voice dropping the wavering rasp. It was deep, resonant, and entirely steady. Crow frowned, his hand instinctively dropping to his taser again. "What did you say to me, trash?" Elias immediately slouched back down, shrinking into the character. "I said I understand, officer. I won't come back." Crow stared at him for a second longer, unnerved but unable to articulate why. He shook his head, regaining his bravado. "Start walking, Jimmy. Keep your eyes forward." Crow and Grant climbed back into the warm cruiser. The engine revved, the tires spun slightly in the gravel, and the vehicle tore off down the dark county road, its taillights quickly fading into the oppressive blackness of the night. Elias Thorne was left standing alone in the freezing darkness, a significant distance from civilization. He waited until the sound of the cruiser's engine was completely swallowed by the wind. Then he stood up straight. He reached down into his left boot, feeling the small rectangular shape of the encrypted GPS tracker. He tapped the single button on its face 3 times in rapid succession. The SOS signal. Within moments, his concealed earpiece chirped to life. "Chief Thorne, this is Captain Harlan." The voice came through crisp and urgent. "We have your distress ping. Are you secure?" "I am secure, Marcus," Elias replied, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He reached under his thermal layers and pressed the stop button on the digital recorder. "The package has been delivered and we have everything we need." "Copy that. I have 3 unmarked units vectoring to your location now. ETA is minutes. Stay out of the wind, sir." "Make it quick, Marcus," Elias said, staring down the dark, empty road where his officers had vanished. "We have a lot of garbage to take out in the morning." The piercing glare of halogen headlights cut through the desolate county woods, fracturing the absolute darkness. 3 unmarked black Chevy Tahoes roared up the gravel turnout, their tires kicking up a storm of frost and dirt. Before the lead vehicle even rocked to a complete halt, the passenger door flew open. Captain Marcus Harlan, a seasoned veteran with a face weathered by decades of city service, stepped out into the freezing wind. He held a heavy wool blanket in one hand and a thermos of black coffee in the other. "Chief!" Harlan called out, his voice fighting the howling wind. Elias Thorne stepped out from the tree line, his false beard dusted with frost, his shoulders shivering uncontrollably despite his iron will. He looked every bit the broken vagrant the patrolman believed him to be, but the fierce, unyielding fire in his eyes told a completely different story. Get in, Harlan urged, wrapping the thick blanket around Elias's shoulders and ushering him into the cavernous, heated back seat of the Tahoe. Waiting inside with an open laptop was Detective Elena Voss, the lead investigator for internal affairs. She was notoriously ruthless, a bulldog of a detective who had built a career dismantling corrupt units. Tonight, she was Thorne's chosen executioner. "Sir," Voss said, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the chief of police looking like a discarded piece of street trash. Let's get to work, Elena, Elias said, his voice raspy from the cold, his hands shaking as he accepted the scalding thermos from Harlan. He took a long, painful sip, feeling the heat radiate down his throat and into his frozen chest. He reached under his layers, ripped the surgical tape off his sternum with a wince, and handed the digital audio recorder to Voss. Voss plugged the device into her laptop. Within seconds, the crisp, undeniable audio of the last hour filled the quiet cabin of the SUV. They listened in silence. They heard the unlawful order, the aggressive physical contact, the blatant violation of civil rights, and the terrifying mocking cruelty of the Starlight Tour. When Crow's voice crackled through the speakers saying, "Consider this a motivational seminar to relocate to a different county," Voss's jaw tightened into a hard, unforgiving line. "Unbelievable," Harlan muttered, staring out the window at the bleak landscape. "Significant distance out in freezing weather. If you were actually an elderly homeless man, David, you'd be dead by morning." "That's the point, Marcus," Elias said, his voice steadying as the Tahoe sped back toward the city limits. "And they didn't care, but here is the piece that matters most. Play back the audio at the section where they mentioned their supervisor." Voss clicked the mouse. "Sergeant Miller has our backs, the Union has our backs. Thorne is going to realize real quick that he can't run this city without us." Elias leaned forward, the heat of the vehicle finally thawing the ice in his bones. "Marcus Harlan," Voss said, typing the name into her database. "Veteran, he's been running the mid-shift at the 4th for years. We've had numerous anonymous tips about a protection racket over there, but no one ever steps up to testify. The victims are always transients, prostitutes, or undocumented immigrants, people who can't or won't go to the authorities." Elias leaned forward, the heat of the vehicle finally thawing the ice in his bones. "It's not just a few bad apples, Elena. It's an orchard rotting from the roots up. Harlan is contracting his officers out as a private, off-the-books enforcement squad for local business owners. He clears the undesirables out of the commercial districts, completely bypassing the judicial system. And I guarantee you he is taking a cash cut from those businesses for the service. We have them on kidnapping, false imprisonment, battery, and conspiracy to violate civil rights," Voss listed, her fingers flying across the keyboard to draft the emergency warrants. "Federal charges, Chief, not state. I'm waking up the U.S. Attorney for the district right now." "Do it," Elias commanded. "And Marcus, I want a full tactical lockdown of the 4th precinct at first light. Nobody goes in, nobody comes out. You confiscate the duty weapons of Crow, Grant, and Harlan the second they cross the threshold." "What about the Union?" Harlan asked, playing devil's advocate. "The moment we move on Harlan, they'll threaten a walkout." "Let them," Elias said, his eyes hard and cold as the city skyline came back into view. "I'd rather patrol this city by myself than employ men who leave the vulnerable to freeze to death in the dark. Drop me at headquarters, Marcus. I need a shower, a razor, and my uniform." Later, the transformation was absolute. Gone was the shivering, hunched vagrant in the soiled military jacket. Standing in front of the full-length mirror in the chief's private suite was Elias Thorne. The theatrical beard was washed away, revealing a strong, square jaw and sharp, calculating eyes. He wore a crisp, midnight blue dress uniform, perfectly tailored. The 4 gold stars on his collar gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His brass nameplate, Thorne, sat perfectly level above his left breast pocket. He didn't just look like a police chief, he looked like a force of nature. "Time to go hunting," Elias whispered to his reflection. He grabbed his service weapon, snapped it into his holster, and walked out of the office. The storm was ready to break. The roll call room of the 4th precinct smelled exactly how it always did at early morning, a potent mixture of damp wool, gun oil, cheap glazed donuts, and stale coffee. The room was packed with officers transitioning between the grueling night shift and the incoming day shift. The night guys looked exhausted, their uniforms rumpled, while the day guys were loud, caffeinated, and complaining about the bitter cold front outside. Sitting at a heavy wooden table near the back of the room were officers Harlan Crow and Riley Grant. They were completely relaxed, radiating an air of smug invincibility. Crow was scrolling through his phone, laughing at a text message, while Grant was aggressively chewing on a fresh piece of gum and detailing their breakfast plans. Standing at the front of the room, leaning casually against the wooden podium, was Sergeant Marcus Harlan. Harlan was a bulldog of a man, thick-necked, red-faced, and carrying extra weight around his midsection. He was holding a clipboard, waiting for the clock to strike the top of the hour to give the daily briefing. At the appointed time, the heavy double doors at the back of the room swung shut with a loud metallic clack. Captain Marcus Harlan, flanked by Detective Elena Voss and several heavily armed internal affairs investigators, stepped in front of the exit, physically blocking it. The room's ambient chatter dialed down slightly as a few officers noticed the IA jackets, a ripple of unease moving through the crowd. IA never showed up at roll call unless blood was about to be spilled. "Lock the doors," Captain Harlan ordered quietly. An investigator threw the heavy deadbolt. A second later, the side door near the podium, the entrance reserved for command staff, opened. Chief Elias Thorne strode into the room. The silence that fell over the 4th precinct was instantaneous and deafening. It was as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked from the air. Cops who were slouching immediately sat bolt upright. Sergeant Harlan practically jumped to attention, tossing his clipboard onto the podium. "Room, attention," Harlan barked, though his voice wavered slightly. 30 pairs of boots snapped together. Elias walked slowly to the center of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of his officers. He let the silence hang, letting the tension build until it felt heavy enough to shatter the fluorescent bulbs overhead. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely calm, which was infinitely more terrifying. "At ease," Elias finally commanded. The officers relaxed their stances, but nobody dared to sit down. Elias moved to the podium. Stepping right next to Sergeant Harlan, he rested his hands on the wood, his gold stars catching the harsh light. "Good morning," Elias began, his deep, resonant voice filling every corner of the silent room. "I know it's unusual for the chief of police to crash a precinct roll call, but I felt it was necessary to address some fundamental principles of our profession, principles that it seems have been forgotten in this building." In the back row, Crow leaned over to Grant. "Here comes the speech," he whispered, rolling his eyes. Grant gave a tight, nervous smirk, but his eyes kept darting to the IA detectives blocking the exit. "We are entrusted with an immense amount of power," Elias continued, pacing slowly across the front of the room. "The power to strip a citizen of their freedom, the power to use force. With that power comes a sacred trust. When we break that trust, we are no longer law enforcement officers. We are an armed gang operating under the color of law." Elias stopped pacing. He turned and locked eyes directly with Officer Harlan Crow. Crow swallowed hard, suddenly feeling exposed. "It's cold out there, isn't it, Officer Crow?" Elias asked, his tone conversational, but his eyes burning like blue-hot steel. Crow blinked, completely caught off guard by the direct address. Yes, sir. Yes, Chief. It's freezing." "Indeed it is." Elias nodded slowly. "Not the kind of weather you'd want to be out in without a good coat. Tell me, Crow, what time do the buses start running in your sector?" A cold bead of sweat broke out on the back of Crow's neck. The specific question triggered a profound sense of déjà vu. Morning, sir?" "Morning," Elias repeated, his voice dropping an octave. "So if a man was sitting on a public bench at that hour waiting, say, for the early express, he'd be loitering, wouldn't he?" Grant abruptly stopped chewing his gum, his face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, chalky white. He stared at the chief, his mind frantically trying to process the impossibility of the words he was hearing. Crow felt a tremor start in his hands. "Sir, I don't—" Elias reached into his tailored uniform pocket. He pulled out a crumpled, mud-stained piece of paper. He walked down the center aisle, the crowd of officers parting for him like the Red Sea. He stopped directly in front of the table where Crow and Grant were seated. With a deliberate, agonizingly slow motion, Elias placed the muddy photograph of the young woman onto the table. "You dropped this, Harlan," Elias said softly. The rasp of the vagrant bled perfectly into the chief's baritone. Crow stared at the photo, his breath hitching in his throat. His eyes darted from the picture to the gold stars to the face of the man he had violently shoved into the back of a cruiser just hours earlier. The beard was gone, the dirt was gone, but the eyes, the hard, unyielding eyes, were exactly the same. "Oh my God," Grant whispered, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror escaping his lips. "Stand up, both of you!" Elias roared, the sheer volume and authority of his voice making half the room flinch. Crow and Grant scrambled to their feet, their knees shaking so violently they could barely hold their own weight. Elias turned his back on them and looked at Detective Voss. "Elena, play the tape." Voss pulled a wireless speaker from her tactical vest and tapped her phone. The audio filled the quiet room. "Put your hands behind your back." "For what? What am I being arrested for?" "You're not being arrested, you're being relocated. Now give me your hands before I break your wrist." The sound of the ratcheting handcuffs, the sickening thud of a body hitting a plastic partition. The 30 other officers in the room stood frozen in absolute horror. They were listening to their colleagues committing a felony, broadcast loud and clear in front of the chief of police and internal affairs. Sergeant Harlan's face had turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. He stepped away from the podium, his hands raised defensively. "Chief Thorne, listen, I don't know what they were doing. This is the first I'm hearing of, Elias raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "Keep playing, Elena." The audio skipped forward. "Sergeant Harlan has our backs. The Union has our backs. Thorne is going to realize real quick that he can't run this city without us." Elias slowly turned his head to look at Sergeant Harlan. The veteran sergeant was physically shaking, his career, his pension, and his freedom evaporating right before his eyes. "It seems you have their backs, Marcus," Elias said, his voice laced with absolute disgust. "And I have the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the United States Attorney's Office, and the full weight of the Constitution." Elias looked back at Crow and Grant. The arrogant, untouchable bullies from the night before were entirely gone. In their place were two terrified boys, realizing that their lives were over. You thought I was trash, Elias said, stepping so close to Crow that the young officer had to look up into the chief's furious eyes. You thought because a man had nothing, he was nothing. You swore an oath to protect the people of this city, and instead you hunted them for sport. Elias turned to Captain Harlan. Strip their badges, Elias commanded, the finality ringing in the air like a gavel strike. Strip their weapons. Arrest officers Crow and Grant for aggravated battery, kidnapping, and federal civil rights violations. Harlan stepped forward, unholstering his handcuffs. And Sergeant Harlan, Elias added, his gaze shifting to the panicked supervisor, arrest him for conspiracy and racketeering. The 4th Precinct is officially under new management. The metallic snick-snick of the handcuffs ratcheting around Officer Harlan Crow's wrists echoed like a gunshot in the dead-silent roll call room. Captain Marcus Harlan was not gentle. He wrenched Crow's arms backward, mirroring the exact brutal angle Crow had used on the chief hours earlier. Crow gasped, his face buried in the polished wood of the table, his service weapon and brass badge already stripped and lying uselessly near the muddy photograph of the fictional daughter. Grant didn't even resist. When Detective Voss approached him, the towering, broad-shouldered cop simply held out his hands, weeping openly. The sudden violent reality of a federal prison sentence had entirely broken his spirit. Sergeant Marcus Harlan, however, still clung to the delusion of his untouchability. As 2 internal affairs investigators grabbed his biceps, he thrashed violently. Get your hands off me, Harlan spat, his face a mask of panicked rage. I'm a veteran. You can't do this, Thorne. The fraternal order won't stand for this ambush. I want my union rep right now. As if summoned by the sheer desperation in Harlan's voice, the heavy deadbolt on the back door clicked and a frantic pounding echoed through the room. Captain Harlan nodded to an investigator who cracked the door open. A man in a sharp, expensive charcoal suit shoved his way into the room. He was clutching a leather briefcase and breathing heavily. It was Attorney Arthur Harlan, the high-priced defense attorney retained by the police union, known throughout the state for making excessive force charges magically disappear. What the hell is going on here? Arthur Harlan demanded, his voice booming with practiced courtroom authority. He took in the sight of the handcuffed officers and the grim faces of IA. Chief Thorne, I'm ordering you to halt these proceedings immediately. My clients are invoking their right to counsel, and unless you have a legally binding warrant, this is an illegal detainment. Elias Thorne did not flinch. He slowly stepped away from the podium and walked toward the high-powered attorney. He towered over Arthur Harlan, the gold stars on his collar gleaming ominously. Mr. Harlan, Elias said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, you are trespassing in a secure law enforcement facility during an active federal raid. Federal raid? Arthur Harlan scoffed, though his eyes darted nervously to the IA agents. You don't have the jurisdiction to authorize... I don't. The Department of Justice does. Elias reached into the inner pocket of his dress uniform jacket and pulled out a thick, folded stack of papers bearing the official seal of the United States District Court. He shoved them aggressively into Arthur Harlan's chest. Signed at dawn by Federal Magistrate Judge William Davies, Elias stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. Arrest warrants for Harlan Crow and Riley Grant for felony kidnapping, aggravated assault, and deprivation of rights under color of law, and for Sergeant Marcus Harlan a federal warrant for racketeering, conspiracy, and extortion. Arthur Harlan scrambled to catch the papers, his eyes skimming the heavy legal text. The color rapidly drained from his face as he realized the magnitude of the situation. There were no union loopholes for federal civil rights violations. The FBI was taking over. Extortion, Arthur Harlan whispered, the fight completely leaving him. Detective Voss, Elias called out, not taking his eyes off the defeated attorney. Update the room on the simultaneous operation. Elena Voss stepped forward, holding her tablet. At first light, an FBI tactical team raided Sergeant Harlan's private residence and his precinct locker. We secured physical ledgers documenting off-the-books cash payments from numerous different local business owners, payments made specifically to Harlan's squad in exchange for the illegal intimidation, assault, and relocation of homeless individuals and minorities from the commercial district. A collective gasp swept through the remaining officers in the room. The casual brutality was one thing, some of them had suspected it and turned a blind eye, but a calculated, organized crime syndicate running out of their own precinct, the shame in the room was palpable. You see, Arthur, Elias said softly, stepping back from the attorney, this isn't an internal review. This isn't a paid administrative leave. This is an eradication. Now step aside or I will have you arrested for obstructing a federal investigation. Arthur Harlan swallowed hard, clutching his briefcase. He looked at Sergeant Harlan, who was staring back at him with wide, pleading eyes. Arthur Harlan slowly shook his head and took 2 steps back, pressing himself against the concrete wall. The blue wall of silence had just been pulverized. Captain Harlan, Elias commanded, take the garbage out. The perp walk was a spectacle. Instead of sneaking the disgraced officers out the back, Elias ordered them march straight through the main bullpen of the 4th Precinct. Dozens of detectives, desk sergeants, and civilian clerks watched in stunned silence as Crow, Grant, and Harlan were led out in steel cuffs, their uniforms stripped of their badges, their heads hung low in ultimate disgrace. When they were finally loaded into the back of the armored federal transport vans waiting outside, Elias stood on the precinct steps, the freezing wind whipping at his uniform. He watched the vans pull away, knowing this was only the first battle in a very long war. Later, the city was still reeling from the shock waves. The story had exploded onto the national news. The headlines were relentless. Police chief goes undercover, dismantles corrupt squad. Starlight tours end in federal indictments. The fallout was massive. The Department of Justice announced a sweeping top-to-bottom audit of the entire police department. Several more officers from the 4th Precinct, terrified by the federal charges, voluntarily turned in their badges and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for leniency. The cancer was being excised cell by corrupt cell. At midday, a massive press conference was assembled on the grand marble steps of City Hall. Hundreds of reporters, community activists, and ordinary citizens crowded the plaza. The air was electric with a mixture of anger, relief, and cautious optimism. Standing behind a cluster of microphones was Mayor Marcus Harlan, looking incredibly grave, but the man the city was waiting for was standing right beside him. Chief Elias Thorne stepped up to the podium. The flashes of cameras strobed violently, a blinding barrage of light that rivaled the spotlight Crow had used to blind him in the freezing dark. Elias looked out over the sea of faces. He saw the marginalized, the forgotten, and the broken, the very people he had disguised himself to protect. He placed his hands on the edges of the podium, grounding himself. Days ago, Elias's deep, booming voice echoed across the plaza, instantly silencing the murmuring crowd. I took a walk through the streets of this city. I did not wear these stars. I did not wear this uniform. I wore the clothes of a man who had fallen on hard times, and in return for simply existing in a public space, I was assaulted, humiliated, and left to freeze to death by the very men sworn to protect me. He paused, letting the heavy reality of his words sink into the crowd. For too long, the badge has been used by some as a shield for bigotry, cruelty, and corruption. They believed that because their victims were invisible to society, their crimes would be invisible to justice. They were wrong. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the muddy, crumpled photograph of the young woman. He held it up for the cameras to see. This picture was meant to be a prop, but it represents something very real. It represents the humanity that bad cops strip away from the people they abuse. When an officer looks at a citizen and sees only trash to be swept away, they forfeit their right to wear the badge. They forfeit their right to be called peace officers. The plaza was completely silent, save for the rapid clicking of camera shutters. To the community of this city, Elias continued, his eyes scanning the crowd, meeting the gazes of the citizens. I cannot fix the past. I cannot undo the trauma inflicted by those who abused their power. But I stand before you today to make an ironclad promise. The era of the Wild West is over. The blue wall of silence has been torn down. From this day forward, accountability is not a buzzword in this department. It is a mandate. He lowered the photograph, his jaw set with fierce determination. We will root out the bullies. We will expel the predators. We will build a police force that serves this city with honor, with empathy, and with absolute unwavering justice. Thank you. The applause started slowly, rippling through the front rows of community organizers before erupting into a deafening roar that echoed off the towering glass buildings of the city skyline. It wasn't just applause, it was the sound of a fractured city finally taking a breath of clean air. Later, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Elias Thorne sat alone in his quiet office at police headquarters. The adrenaline of the past days had finally faded, leaving a deep, bone-weary exhaustion in its wake. He knew the fight was far from over. The union would push back. The systemic rot would take time to fully cleanse. There would be more long nights, more battles, and more resistance. He leaned back in his leather chair and looked down at his expansive mahogany desk. Right next to his gold-plated nameplate, framed in simple, elegant glass, was the muddy, crumpled photograph of the fictional daughter. He kept it there not as a prop, but as a permanent reminder. A reminder of the freezing cold, the biting steel of the handcuffs, and the absolute necessity of staying vigilant. As long as there were predators hiding behind a badge, Elias Thorne would be waiting for them in the dark. If you felt your heart pounding during this fight for justice, don't let the story end here. Like this video to show your support for real accountability and true leadership. Share this incredible story with your friends and family to spread the message that nobody is above the law. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another thrilling real-life tale of justice served. Leave a comment below telling us what you would have done if you were Chief Thorne.